Hello! In this video, we're going to be talking about the muscular system. So, muscle tissue actually makes up nearly half of the body's mass. And what muscle tissue does is that it transforms that chemical energy that our cells use, ATP, into mechanical energy, which we use to exert force to do things like move around. When we talk about muscle tissue, we are going to be using the words parts myo, mys, and sarco. So if you see myo, mys, or sarco, like for example the sarcoplasm, which is what we call the cytoplasm inside of muscle cells, you know that we're talking about muscles. And as you remember from when we were talking about different types of tissues, there are three types of muscle tissues. Skeletal muscle tissue, which is going to be that voluntary muscle tissue that we're going to be primarily focused on. Cardiac muscle tissue, which is going to be the muscle tissue that makes up the muscles of the heart, and then smooth muscle tissue, which is going to be found in hollow organs that's involuntary and used to regulate a lot of our autonomic processes. So the important functions of muscles are going to be to produce movement. So that's usually what we think about when we think about muscles, right? Walking around, moving around. So this is going to allow us to both move around, walk around, run, jump, climb trees. However, they're also important for producing internal movement. Our cardiac muscle tissue is going to be responsible for pumping blood throughout our body. Our smooth muscle tissue is going to be useful for things like moving our food through our digestive tract. Muscles are actually going to be used all the time, even when you're not moving around, just to do things like maintain your posture and your body position. Just sitting in the chair requires using your muscles. If you didn't have what's called muscle tone, you would just sort of slump over. Muscles, as we talked about before, are also going to be important for stabilizing joints. If you've ever injured a joint and gone into physical therapy, one of the things that they really focus on is strengthening the muscles that support a joint in order to stabilize it and reduce the risk of injuring that joint again. And we've talked about before how muscles are used to generate heat. For your negative feedback, if you get too cold, one of the things you do is you start to shiver, and that rapid muscle contraction, that conversion of ATP into mechanical energy, is going to produce heat as a waste product, and we can use that to bring our body temperature back up. The characteristics of muscle tissues, and this is true of all of our muscle tissues, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, is that they are excitable. They have this responsiveness. They're able to detect stimuli and then respond to that stimulus. Exactly which stimulus they respond to is going to change depending on the type of muscle tissue, but they all have this excitability, which you may also see called irritability, which doesn't mean that they're easily upset. It means that they respond when stimulated. Then what muscle cells really do is they contract. They have this contractility. What muscle cells do is that when they are stimulated, they get shorter, and that's going to generate force. They also have this extensibility. Essentially, they are stretchy, and elasticity, meaning that after they're stretched, they return to their original length. So excitability or responsiveness, again, this is the ability to receive and respond to stimuli. One of the main forms of stimulus that we're going to talk about is what are called neurotransmitters that get released from nerve cells. Some muscle cells also respond to being stretched, and this is going to, what these do is they cause changes in the electrical potential across the plasma membrane. What happens when the cell gets stimulated like this is we get this wave of depolarization that spreads across the whole cell, what's called an action potential. And it's called that because it's a potential. It's a change in the electrical potential across the plasma membrane that's going to move, and it's going to trigger the cell to respond. So when a skeletal muscle, for example, gets stimulated by the neurotransmitters from a neuron, that action potential spreads across the muscle and causes it to contract. And we'll go over exactly how that happens. So contractility, again, this is what muscles do. They have the ability to shorten forcibly when stimulated. And that's the only way that they're going to be generating force, really, is by contracting. You can see here that we have what are called antagonistic muscles, where one muscle can contract in order to move one way, and we can have another muscle contract in order to move the other way. For example, we have this biceps brachii, and then we have the triceps brachii. And the biceps brachii is going to be contract in order to produce flexion, whereas the triceps on the posterior side of the arm is going to contract in order to produce extension. We also have extensibility and elasticity. So extensibility means that it can be stretched, and elasticity means that it's going to return to its normal resting length. So muscles work kind of like springs. We can stretch them, which is typically only going to occur passively, like when you're carrying a load or when they get stretched by another muscle contracting. And then they have this elasticity, which makes them want to return to their resting length after being stretched. We're going to primarily focus on skeletal muscle tissue. We'll talk a bit about smooth muscle tissue as well. However, we will quickly go over all three types of muscle tissue. So we have skeletal muscle tissue. This is going to be our voluntary muscle tissue that's used to move around our body. And our skeletal muscle tissue is packed into what we call skeletal muscles. And these are organs, so made up of different types of tissue, and we'll talk about the different types of tissues that make up a skeletal muscle, that are going to be attached to bones and sometimes to skin. And this is only true for certain facial muscles. Skeletal muscle fibers, these are, remember when we say muscle fiber, that is referring to a single muscle cell. So muscle fiber and muscle cell means the same exact thing. They are skeletal muscle fibers are the longest of the muscles, and they have striations, these light and dark stripes that we see going perpendicular to the length of the muscle cell. Skeletal muscle fibers are actually fused from multiple cells coming together, and so they are multinucleate. They have multiple nuclei. Voluntary muscles means that they can be controlled consciously. You can actively move them around. You don't always actively think about how you're moving, but skeletal muscles are voluntary. You can control them. This is in contrast to cardiac muscles and smooth muscles that we don't have conscious control over. Skeletal muscles are very powerful and can contract rapidly, but they also tire relatively easily compared to cardiac muscles and smooth muscles that can essentially work all the time. Again, our skeletal muscle cells are called muscle fibers or myofibers, but don't confuse this with what are called myofibrils and myofilaments. And we'll go over the differences of all of those and how muscles are put together. Cardiac muscle tissue is the muscle tissue that's only found in the heart. And it's going to make up the bulk of the heart walls, what we call the myocardium. Like skeletal muscle, it is striated, but unlike skeletal muscle, instead of being these long cylindrical cells, they're these short branching cells. They are also uninucleate, meaning one nucleus per cell, and they are going to be connected together at what are called intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs are going to have gap junctions in them that are going to allow electrical signals to flow from one cell to another. Remember, electrical signals are what are going to cause muscle cells to contract. So this is going to be important in organizing the contraction of the heart as one functional unit. Cardiac muscle cells are involuntary, meaning we don't have conscious control over them. They actually have their own pacemakers cells in them that give them a natural heart rate, but our nervous system can affect that rate. We actually constantly apply what's called vagal tone to our heart that actually slows it down to the average resting heart rate of about 60 beats per minute. By itself, the heart would contract at about 100 beats per minute, and then we can apply a different form of stimulation in order to ramp that up to 120, 150, can go really high, sometimes dangerously high, what we call tachycardia. When we talk about cardiac muscle cells, think cardiac, striated, involuntary, and of course, they are going to have these intercalated discs. And then we have our smooth muscle tissue. And smooth muscle tissue is non-striated, so it looks smoother. It's also going to be these spindle-shaped cells, sort of shaped like an elongated football. And we're going to find smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs like the stomach, the urinary bladder, and the airways. We do not consciously control smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is controlled by a lot of different factors. Sometimes it's controlled by the local conditions. Sometimes it's controlled by the nervous system. But when it's controlled by the nervous system, it's an involuntary part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. So, skeletal muscle cells, long, cylindrical, striated, multinucleated cells. Cardiac muscle cells are going to be these short, branching, striated, uninucleate cells that have these intercalated discs. And then smooth muscle cells are going to be these relatively short, spindle-shaped cells that are also uninucleate that do not have striations. When we look at the anatomy of a skeletal muscle, it is going to be made up of different tissues, including nerve and blood supply, connective tissue sheaths, and its attachment points to bones. Skeletal muscles are going to be made up of these groups of bundled together muscle fibers or myofibers, again, individual cells that get packaged into fascicles. So here we have a whole muscle, then we have a bundle of muscles, then we have individual cells, and then inside of the cells we have what are called myofibrils. Let's do that one more time. Whole muscle, bundle of cells called a fascicle, individual muscle cells, and then we have these myofibrils inside of the muscle cells. Each skeletal muscle, so again, the whole muscle, is going to receive a nerve, an artery, and veins. The artery is going to supply blood in order to supply the nutrients and oxygen that muscles need, and then the veins are going to remove waste products. Our nerve is going to allow us to have our conscious control of our muscles. Our connective tissue sheaths, so we are going to have connective tissue surrounding each individual cell, each individual muscle fiber, as well as surrounding the bundles of cells, our fascicles, and then around the whole muscle all together. So we call that layer that surrounds the whole muscle the epimysium. Remember, epi is going to be our word part that means above or on top of. So enclosing, going above the whole muscle, we're going to have the epimysium. And then peri means around. So around each fascicle, we are going to have the perimysium. Remember, this word part is going to mean muscle. And then we are going to have the epimysium, which is this areolar connective tissue that goes around each individual muscle fiber, aka each individual muscle cell. So, around each muscle cell, inside the fascicle, we have the endomysium. Then around the fascicle, we have the paramysium. And then on top of everything going around the whole muscle, we have the epimysium. Epimysium around the whole muscle, paramysium around the fascicle, endomysium inside the fascicle around each muscle fiber, aka muscle cell. And then that muscle needs to be attached. As we talked about when we talked about joints, each muscle is going to be attached to bone at two places, what we call the insertion and the origin. The insertion is going to be the attachment to a movable bone, and the origin is going to be an attachment to a relatively immovable or less movable bone. So here we have, again, the biceps brachii, which is going to be attached to the scapula at its origin and the radius at its insertion. And when the biceps contracts, the radius is going to move, whereas the scapula isn't. When you flex your bicep, your radius is going to move towards your shoulder. Your shoulder doesn't move towards your radius. These attachments can be either what we call direct attachments or indirect attachments. If we have a direct attachment, that means that the epimysium itself is fused directly to the perosteum of the bone or to the perichondrium of cartilage. So here you can see the temporalis muscle where it just sort of attaches directly to the skull. Then we can have indirect connections where we have this connective tissue wrapping that goes beyond the muscle itself. And this can form into either a rope-like band called a tendon, or it can spread out into this sheet-like structure that we call an aponeurosis. So here we have the tendon, and here we have an aponeurosis.